and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
For a long time, people believed the biggest power in this industry was money. Then they said it was fame, then influence, and then fear. But this documentary forces a different realization. The real power was never loud. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that feels normal, the kind that lets everyone keep moving forward without ever stopping to explain anything fully. That's why this moment matters, because when 50 Cent releases this documentary, it doesn't arrive like a bomb. It arrives like a rewind. It takes moments people already saw, moments people already accepted, and it places them closer together, not years apart, not separated by headlines, not softened by time, side by side. And once that happens, the story feels different. This isn't about sudden revelations or secret files. It's about patterns that were always visible, but never connected. People saw the proximity. They saw the relationships. They saw who stayed close, who stayed silent, and who never explained anything beyond surface-level answers. But those moments were always treated as individual events. This documentary doesn't do that. It asks a quieter question. Why did certain conversations always stop early? Why did explanations never fully land? Why did time keep replacing clarity? Because silence isn't empty. Silence is a decision, and decisions repeat. You start noticing how often powerful figures didn't deny, they delayed. They didn't explain, they distanced. They didn't confront, they waited. Waiting feels mature. Waiting feels strategic. Waiting feels safe. But waiting also lets stories fade without being resolved. That's the tension this documentary builds. Not by accusing, not by exaggerating, but by refusing to let unfinished moments stay unfinished. You begin to notice how certain environments were normalized without being examined, how access was granted without explanation, how questions about age, proximity, and influence were always framed carefully and never fully walked through. Not illegal, not explosive, unresolved. And unresolved stories don't disappear. They just wait for the right lens. Before we go deeper into this video, make sure you like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss any update. Because this isn't a one-clip story, it's a long one. What makes this uncomfortable isn't what's being said, it's what never was. Because denial invites scrutiny, silence invites time, and time has always protected power. But the audience changed. People don't forget the way they used to. Old interviews don't vanish. Past moments don't stay buried. When you replay them now, the energy feels different. You notice how often clarity was promised later, how often later never came, how often silence was treated as dignity instead of avoidance. That doesn't mean someone is guilty of something. It means something didn't need to be addressed. And that only works when power feels secure. This documentary doesn't expose crimes, it exposes comfort. The comfort of never having to explain certain things, the comfort of trusting time to smooth everything out, the comfort of knowing silence would do the work. But silence only works when people move on. And people aren't moving on anymore. They're watching patterns instead of moments. They're listening to what isn't said. They're noticing where stories pause instead of end. That's where this story begins. Not with accusation, not with shock, with a question that never went away. If nothing needed to be hidden, why was silence always the answer? Once you accept that silence was the real currency, everything else starts to line up. Not in a dramatic way, in a disturbing one, because you begin to see how carefully distance was managed, how moments that should have led to explanations were allowed to dissolve instead, how proximity to power created immunity without anyone ever having to say it out loud. This documentary doesn't rush those realizations. It slows them down. It lets you sit with the fact that certain relationships were never hidden. They were normalized, seen in public, discussed casually, then quietly removed from deeper conversation. And normalization is powerful, because once something feels normal, questioning it feels unreasonable. That's how silence protects without defending. You notice how stories were always framed as isolated. One year here, another year there, Different headlines, different contexts, never stacked. But when you stack them, the gaps become impossible to ignore. The same pauses, the same evasions, the same refusal to fully explain the why, even when the opportunity was right there. What's unsettling is how calm everything feels while this is happening. No panic, no urgency, just confidence that time will take care of it. That confidence didn't come from innocence, it came from experience. Experience knowing how quickly attention fades. Experience knowing that audiences move on. Experience knowing that silence rarely gets punished. Until it does. This is where the documentary quietly changes the power dynamic. Because it doesn't ask viewers to believe anything new. It asks them to remember differently. To remember moments they already accepted, but now without the distance of time. To hear old answers without the benefit of distraction. To notice how often explanations stopped just before they became meaningful. That's not coincidence. That's design. Design doesn't require secrecy, it requires timing. And timing has always favored those who can afford to wait. But waiting only works when people stop watching. They didn't. They just learned how to watch slower. And slow attention changes everything. Because now silence isn't interpreted as maturity, it's interpreted as strategy. Now distance doesn't feel respectful, it feels calculated. Now the absence of explanation doesn't feel neutral, it feels intentional. That shift doesn't create outrage, it creates pressure. Pressure that doesn't explode, pressure that accumulates. This is why the documentary feels heavy instead of loud. It doesn't accuse, it observes. It lets patterns reveal themselves without commentary. And patterns don't need narration, they explain themselves. By the time you reach this point, you're no longer asking what happened. You're asking why nothing followed, why conversations always paused, why timelines were never completed, why silence arrived exactly where clarity should have lived. Silence like that doesn't erase questions. It stores them. And stored questions don't disappear, they wait. Waiting for the moment when the audience stops rushing ahead and finally looks back. That moment is now. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling crowded. Crowded with things that were never said. There's a point where a story stops being about individuals and starts being about structure. That's where this sits. Because once you step back, you realize how little effort it takes to maintain silence when the system itself is built to reward it. Nobody has to coordinate. Nobody has to agree. Everyone just understands the rules. Don't press too hard. Don't linger too long. Don't connect what was never meant to be connected. And that understanding becomes culture. What the documentary exposes isn't a hidden vault or a forbidden clip. It exposes how comfort works at the highest levels. Comfort in knowing that even uncomfortable moments will be treated gently. Comfort in knowing that curiosity will burn out before answers are required. Comfort in knowing that silence has always been mistaken for restraint. That comfort is what people are starting to question. Because restraint is supposed to lead somewhere. It's supposed to end with clarity. But here, restraint just kept repeating itself. Again and again, different years, different headlines, same result. Nothing fully addressed, nothing fully closed. You start to notice how often conversations were redirected instead of resolved. How frequently narratives shifted just enough to avoid depth. How answers sounded polished but strangely hollow, as if they were designed to end discussion rather than invite it. That's not an accident. That's what happens when power learns that explanation is optional. When power realizes that reputation can carry more weight than accountability. When it understands that silence doesn't create backlash, it creates fatigue. And fatigued audiences stop asking. Until they don't. What's different now is that fatigue never arrived. People didn't lose interest. They just changed how they paid attention. Instead of chasing the next headline, they started revisiting old ones. Instead of reacting emotionally, they started observing patterns. Patterns don't argue, they accumulate. You see the same avoidance at the same pressure points, the same refusal to elaborate when context would matter most, the same expectation that time will smooth everything out. Time didn't smooth this out, it sharpened it. Because with distance, people stopped being distracted by hype and started focusing on consistency. And consistency is where narratives either hold up or fall apart. This isn't about saying something shocking. It's about letting the silence speak long enough for its shape to become visible. And once that shape appears, it's impossible to pretend it isn't there. The documentary doesn't push you toward a conclusion. It removes the distractions that kept you from noticing the question. The question isn't what happened. The question is, why was this never fully addressed when it could have been? That's the crack. Because unanswered questions don't fade when people stop panicking. They grow when people calm down. Calm scrutiny is dangerous to any system that relies on delay. That's why the tone here matters. There's no rush, no escalation, no urgency, just patience. And patience is the one thing silence can't outrun. Once patience enters the room, silence stops being protective. It becomes revealing, revealing not of guilt, but of habit. And habits tell you everything about how power expects to operate. At this point, the story isn't unfolding forward, it's folding inward. Each new moment gets compared against the old ones. Each reaction gets measured against past silences. Each non-response adds weight instead of removing it. That's the shift. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses, but nothing disappears anymore either. And when silence can no longer erase, all it can do is wait. The problem is, and the audience learned how to wait too. By this point, something subtle has already shifted. You're no longer watching for new information, you're watching for reactions. Because when a system has relied on silence for too long, the real signal isn't what it says. It's how it behaves when people stop moving on. That's where this documentary quietly applies pressure, not by pushing, by waiting. You start noticing how rare direct explanations actually are, how often moments are acknowledged without being explored, how frequently stories are allowed to exist without ever being completed. That's not because answers are unavailable. It's because completion was never the goal. Completion creates records. Records invite comparison. Comparison invites accountability. Silence avoids all three. What's unsettling is how effective this approach has been. Not because people were fooled, but because they were trained. Trained to accept restraint as wisdom, trained to see distance as maturity, trained to believe that if something truly mattered, someone else would have already addressed it. That assumption did most of the work. The documentary doesn't break that assumption loudly. It just removes the comfort around it. It shows how often someone else never actually existed, how responsibility dissolved into shared quiet, how power didn't need to coordinate. It only needed everyone to assume coordination was happening somewhere behind the scenes. That's the illusion. And once the illusion cracks, silence feels different. It stops feeling neutral. It stops feeling dignified. It starts feeling selective. Selective about when to speak, selective about what to explain, selective about how much context the audience is trusted with. Trust is the key word here. Because when explanations are consistently withheld, it signals a belief that the audience doesn't need the full picture, that fragments are enough, that distance will do the rest. That belief worked when attention was fast and shallow. Attention isn't fast anymore. People rewind now. They compare. They place moments side by side. And when they do, they see how often the same strategy appears at the same pressure points. Right when clarity would force something to change, right when timelines would lock, right when answers would stop being optional. That repetition creates weight, not outrage. Weight. Weight that follows every appearance, every interview, every carefully chosen pause. The documentary doesn't add to that weight. It simply refuses to relieve it. It doesn't offer closure where none exists. It doesn't smooth edges that were never addressed. It lets the discomfort sit exactly where it belongs. And discomfort like this doesn't fade with time. It grows quieter, but heavier. That's why nothing dramatic needs to happen next. No statement, no reveal, no escalation. The story already reached the stage where silence has to carry its own meaning. And silence was never built for that. It was built to delay, to soften, to outlast curiosity. Curiosity adapted. It learned how to slow down, how to remember, how to wait without forgetting. That's the problem silence can't solve. Because when the audience stops rushing, silence stops working. And once that happens, every pause becomes visible, Every non-answer becomes intentional, and every moment that was meant to fade quietly becomes part of a pattern that refuses to disappear. That's where this part of the story leaves us. Not with conclusions, but with clarity about one thing. The quiet wasn't accidental. It was the system, and systems don't collapse when they're attacked. They weaken when they're understood. At this stage, the story stops feeling like something that's unfolding and starts feeling like something that was always there. Not hidden, just spaced out. Because when you look closely, you realize how carefully everything was separated. Moments that should have touched were kept years apart. Questions that should have connected were treated as unrelated. Each situation isolated enough to dismiss on its own. Isolation is protection. That's how systems survive without ever needing to lie. They don't deny. They don't explain. They just make sure nothing ever lines up long enough to form a complete picture. This documentary doesn't expose a secret. It collapses distance. And once distance collapses, timing becomes visible. You begin to notice how often clarity was delayed instead of denied, how responses were postponed rather than refused, how conversations were promised later. Knowing later rarely arrives with the same urgency. Later is where pressure goes to disappear. But here's the shift. Later never came. And now everything exists in the same moment. Old interviews don't feel old anymore. Past reactions don't feel resolved. Silence that once felt calm now feels calculated. That's not hindsight bias. That's pattern recognition. Because the same choices repeat under different circumstances. The same restraint appears whenever stakes rise. The same avoidance shows up whenever explanation would lock something into record. Records are dangerous. They don't forget. They don't soften. That's why silence was always safer. But safety depends on one thing. People moving on. They didn't. They slowed down. And slow attention doesn't need proof to feel something is off. It just needs consistency. Consistency in what's addressed. Consistency in what's avoided. Consistency in how often silence shows up at the exact same moments. That consistency becomes the message. By now, you're no longer waiting for answers. You're watching behavior, watching who steps forward and who steps back, watching how often explanations are offered, and how often they're carefully kept incomplete. Incomplete is important because incomplete stories don't end. They hover, they linger, they resurface every time something new appears and doesn't quite fit. That lingering creates pressure without noise. No outrage, no demands, just awareness that doesn't leave. This is where silence starts to work against itself. Because silence assumes forgetfulness. It assumes distraction. It assumes the audience will eventually lose interest. But the audience didn't lose interest. They lost trust in distance. They stopped believing time equals resolution. They stopped assuming that unanswered questions were answered somewhere else. And once that assumption breaks, silence loses its camouflage. It stops blending in. It stands out. Every pause becomes noticeable. Every non-response feels deliberate. Every carefully neutral statement feels engineered, not to deceive, but to delay. Delay worked when attention was fast. It fails when attention becomes patient. That's the tension sitting underneath this part of the story. Nothing explosive is happening. Nothing dramatic is unfolding. Yet the weight is heavier than ever, because the audience now understands something fundamental. Silence wasn't the absence of truth. It was the method. And methods don't disappear just because they're noticed. They get tested, quietly and over time, by people who are no longer rushing past the gaps. By this point, something subtle but irreversible has happened in the viewer's mind. The story is no longer about what's being shown. It's about what consistently isn't. Because when powerful figures truly have nothing to clarify, silence doesn't repeat itself this often. Silence appears once, maybe twice. It doesn't return at the same pressure points across decades, across different controversies, across different eras of influence. Repetition is where silence stops being neutral and starts becoming structural. And structures don't form accidentally. This is the moment where the documentary stops feeling like content and starts feeling like context. You're no longer consuming information. You're watching how information has been managed, how timing has been used as insulation, how distance has been used as protection, how reputation has been allowed to stand in for explanation. What's unsettling isn't that answers weren't given. It's how comfortable everyone became with that fact. Because comfort is the real currency of power. If silence is accepted, it becomes invisible. If it becomes invisible, it never has to justify itself. And that's exactly what allowed so many moments to pass without ever being revisited properly. This is where people start to realize the story didn't stall. It was paused on purpose. Paused long enough for urgency to fade. Paused long enough for attention to move elsewhere. Paused long enough for it to feel unreasonable to bring it back up. And when something feels unreasonable to question, it's already been protected. What this part forces you to confront is how rarely clarity was actually necessary for things to continue moving forward. Careers progressed, partnerships expanded, influence deepened, all without ever circling back to unfinished conversations. That doesn't happen in fragile systems. That happens in confident ones. Confident that silence will be interpreted as maturity, confident that restraint will be praised, confident that the absence of explanation won't be mistaken for avoidance, because the system trained people not to expect explanations in the first place. But expectations change. The audience changed. People stopped assuming answers existed somewhere else. They stopped believing time automatically resolved things. They started noticing that every time a full explanation would have closed a loop, silence showed up instead. And silence doesn't close loops. It keeps them open. Open loops don't disappear, they accumulate. And accumulated questions don't demand answers loudly. They wait. They sit. They resurface every time something new doesn't quite align. That's why this part feels heavier without becoming louder. Nothing shocking is being revealed. No bombshell is dropped. Instead, something far more destabilizing is happening. The benefit of the doubt is quietly expiring. Not through outrage, through awareness. And awareness doesn't need proof to change behavior. It changes how people listen, how they interpret pauses, how they read statements that sound polished but say very little. Once that shift happens, silence loses its flexibility. It can no longer mean anything people want it to mean. It becomes what it always was, a choice. And choices once recognized don't fade with time. They follow everything that comes next. At this stage of the story, the tension no longer comes from what might be revealed next. It comes from what has already been seen and still hasn't been addressed. Because once patterns are visible, silence stops functioning as a pause and starts functioning as a response. Not a denial, not an explanation, a response. And responses carry meaning even when they say nothing. This is where the audience's role quietly changes. People stop waiting to be told what matters and start deciding for themselves. They stop asking, is there proof? And begin asking, why has this never been fully walked through? That question lingers longer. It doesn't burn out. It doesn't need outrage to survive. What makes this moment dangerous for any powerful system isn't accusation. It's consistency. The same calm, the same distance, the same refusal to engage deeply when engagement would actually bring closure. When restraint shows up once, it looks disciplined. When it shows up every time clarity is needed, it looks intentional. And intention is where the story gains weight. Because intention suggests planning. It suggests confidence that nothing bad will come from staying quiet. It suggests trust in the system, not to protect truth, but to protect momentum. Careers kept moving. Partnerships stayed intact. Influence expanded, all while key conversations remained unfinished. That doesn't happen by luck. It happens when silence has been tested before, and it worked. This is the part people don't like to admit. Silence is effective. It slows narratives down. It drains urgency. It makes people feel dramatic for remembering things too clearly. And for a long time, that strategy held. But something shifted. Not because one person spoke louder, not because one documentary aired, because memory stopped resetting. Clips didn't vanish. Interviews didn't feel old. Context didn't disappear. Everything began living in the same moment. And when past and present sit side by side, differences stand out. Tone shifts. Energy changes. Gaps become visible. Those gaps are doing the talking now. Not in headlines, not in accusations. In the quiet discomfort people feel when something doesn't quite add up anymore. That discomfort doesn't scream. It stays. It reappears when another silence arrives right on schedule, when another chance to clarify passes, when another explanation never comes. And every time that happens, the audience learns something new, not about events, but about priorities. Because if something mattered enough to protect, it mattered enough to avoid explaining. This is where the documentary becomes unsettling without ever becoming explicit. It doesn't tell you what to think. It lets you notice what keeps repeating. It lets you feel how often resolution was possible and how often it was postponed instead. Postponement is subtle. It feels reasonable until it becomes permanent. Permanent postponement is how stories survive without answers. And now, instead of chasing the next reveal, people are watching the behavior around the silence itself. Who stays visible? Who pulls back? Who engages selectively? Who relies on distance rather than clarity? Those observations don't fade when the video ends. They carry forward. And once that happens, silence no longer protects the story. It becomes the story. By this point, the story has stopped being about what might come out next. It's about what still hasn't been said. Even now. Because once a system realizes people are watching patterns instead of moments, the usual tricks stop working. Silence doesn't cool things down anymore. It sharpens them. Every pause becomes noticeable. Every non-response becomes part of the record. That's the uncomfortable shift happening here. For years, the industry relied on speed, fast news cycles, short attention spans, the idea that tomorrow would replace today before anyone had time to sit with unanswered questions. That environment rewarded silence. It turned no comment into a form of control. But control only works when the audience keeps moving. This time they didn't. Instead of reacting, people slowed down. They revisited. They compared. They noticed how often the same restraint appeared at the same pressure points, how certain conversations always stopped right before becoming complete, how clarity was always just one step away and somehow never reached. That repetition matters because repetition turns coincidence into design, and design tells you more than any accusation ever could. What makes this stage of the story heavy isn't shock, it's recognition. Recognition that the system wasn't built to explain itself. It was built to outlast questions, to trust that time would soften everything, that memory would blur, that silence would eventually feel like resolution. But resolution never arrived, and unresolved stories don't disappear. They accumulate. They sit quietly in the background until the weight becomes noticeable. That's what people are feeling now, not outrage. Pressure. Pressure created by the absence of answers, by the growing sense that silence was chosen, not forced, that explanation was avoided, not impossible. This is where the balance shifts. Because when audiences stop demanding drama and start demanding coherence, power has fewer places to hide. You can delay anger, you can wait out headlines, but you can't erase a collective sense that something never added up. And once that feeling settles in, it doesn't matter how calm the response is. Calm stops reading as confidence. It starts reading as distance. Distance from accountability, distance from context, distance from closure. What's striking is how consistent that distance has been. Across years, across situations, across entirely different moments that all ended the same way, with nothing fully addressed. That's not chaos. That's structure. And structures don't collapse loudly. They weaken quietly when people stop accepting their logic. This is the point where silence stops being neutral. It becomes data. Evidence, not of wrongdoing, but of strategy. Strategy built on patience, hierarchy, and the belief that explanation was optional. That belief held for a long time. It doesn't anymore, because now every future silence will be measured against the past ones. Every pause will be compared. Every absence of clarity will add weight instead of removing it. And once silence starts adding weight, it loses its power. That's why this moment doesn't feel explosive. It feels inevitable. Because when people stop forgetting, silence stops working. At this stage, something important has already happened. Even if nothing new has been revealed, the audience has stopped waiting for permission to question the silence. That's the real shift. Because for a long time, silence only worked when people assumed there must be a reason for it. Legal, strategic, respectful, mature. Silence was given the benefit of the doubt, but now that benefit is gone. Not replaced by certainty, replaced by awareness. People are no longer asking, what are they hiding? They're asking, why has this never been clearly explained? And that question doesn't need proof to survive. It feeds on repetition, on patterns, on the simple fact that every opportunity to close the loop was quietly passed over. This is where power usually recalibrates, where it expects things to cool down, where it waits for attention to drift somewhere else. That tactic worked when audiences were reactive, when outrage burned fast and disappeared faster. But this audience isn't reacting. They're observing. Observation is slower, quieter, and far more dangerous to systems built on timing, because observers don't need answers right away. They're comfortable letting silence speak, and then judging what it says. And what it says right now is this: explanation was never prioritized. That realization doesn't explode. It settles. It settles into how people hear interviews, how they watch appearances, how they read statements that feel polished but incomplete. Suddenly, words are weighed against what still hasn't been addressed. This is where silence starts working against itself, because silence depends on forgetting, on emotional fatigue, on the belief that time erases discomfort. But time hasn't erased this one. It's organized it. Moments that once felt isolated are now being placed side by side. Early comments, mid-career deflections, later non-responses. Together they form a shape, not a conclusion, a structure. And once a structure is visible, it doesn't matter how calm it looks. People stop assuming innocence by default. They start asking whether avoidance has been mistaken for wisdom. That's a dangerous question for any system, because avoidance can be strategic, but strategy implies intent, and intent invites scrutiny. What makes this phase uncomfortable is that no one needs to accuse anyone of anything. The silence itself is enough to keep the conversation alive. Every new pause feels heavier than the last, not because it confirms guilt, but because it confirms habit. Habit of not engaging, habit of letting time do the work, habit of trusting that nothing needs to be finished. But unfinished stories don't end. They follow. They follow into every future moment, every public appearance, every carefully chosen word. Because once people notice that answers never came before, they don't expect them now. They watch to see if they're still being avoided. And that's where control starts to slip. Not dramatically, gradually. Because power isn't challenged by noise. It's challenged when people stop accepting silence as an answer. By the time a story reaches this point, something irreversible has already happened. It no longer belongs to the people at the center of it. It belongs to memory. That's the part power can't negotiate with. Memory doesn't need new evidence. It doesn't need confirmation. It doesn't even need outrage. It only needs consistency. And consistency is exactly what people have started to notice. The same gaps, the same pauses, the same moments where explanation could have ended the conversation and didn't. This is where silence stops being a shield and becomes a record. Every time nothing is said, it adds weight. Not loud weight, quiet weight. The kind that doesn't explode but never disappears. The kind that sits underneath everything that comes next. Because now whenever someone speaks, people don't just hear what's being said. They measure it against what was never said before. They compare tone to timing. They listen for context and notice when it's missing. That changes the rules completely. Silence used to mean control. Now it means calculation, and calculation invites evaluation. This is why the story doesn't need a dramatic ending. No final reveal, no confession, no viral moment. Those things satisfy curiosity, but they don't sustain attention. What sustains attention is unresolved structure, a structure where moments were spaced out just enough to avoid confrontation, where time was trusted to soften everything, where reputation was expected to fill in the blanks, where silence was allowed to stand in for explanation. That structure worked until people stopped moving on. Now the audience isn't chasing closure. They're tracking behavior. They're watching what happens when the same strategy is used again, when questions resurface and are met with distance instead of clarity. And distance doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels intentional. That's the shift. Not from belief to disbelief, from assumption to awareness. People aren't saying, this proves something happened. They're saying, this explains why nothing was ever finished. And unfinished stories don't fade. They linger, they resurface quietly. They shape perception without ever needing to shout. This is the kind of pressure that doesn't break overnight. It stays. It follows future interviews, future appearances, future silences. It turns every pause into a signal and every non-answer into context. Because once silence is recognized as a choice, it can never go back to being invisible. That's where this story truly ends. Not with answers, but with a permanent change in how silence is heard. Not as dignity, not as restraint, but as strategy. And strategies, once seen, can never be unseen. The audience has learned how to wait without forgetting. And that's something silence was never designed to survive.